Welcome back. So we're going to do another word problem involving systems of equations. Okay, so this word problem is a little bit complicated. It's got a mixture and it's got percent. So this is a percent mixture problem. So there's a lot of information going on, and I want to help you organize it and make it clear so that you understand how to set up the equations. So let's read the problem. The problem says a chef is going to use a mixture of two brands of Italian dressing. The first brand contains 5% vinegar, and the second brand contains 13% vinegar. The chef wants to make 360 milliliters of a dressing that's 6% vinegar. How much of each brand should she use? So there's a lot of things going on here. There's liquid, right? The dressings. She's got two dressings that she's going to mix together to make a third dressing. And there's percents, and there's a certain amount of vinegar in each of these dressings. A certain percentage of the dressing is vinegar. So the most important step is the first step. Remember that. And that's declaring or defining your variables. And you have to be specific, because if you're vague, if you're not clear, if you're not specific about your variables, then you're not going to know how to set up your equations. You're not going to understand what's going on. So let's look at what we're asked to find. We're asked to find how much of each brand she should use. So what does how much mean? Are they talking about how many bottles? Are they talking about a percentage? We have to think about that. So if you read it again, it says that the chef wants to make 360 milliliters of a dressing in the end. She wants to end up with 360 milliliters. So it makes sense that she's going to use a certain number of milliliters of the first brand and mix it with another amount, another certain number of milliliters of the second brand, and she's going to mix those two together and end up with 360 milliliters. Okay, so the unknowns are the number of milliliters of each brand that she's going to use. So let's write that down. Always write it down. So I'm going to use X for the amount of the first brand in milliliters. Okay? I could have said number of milliliters of the first brand. That's another way to say it. But always specify what the units are, so you know you're talking about milliliters and not percents. My second variable is Y, and Y is going to stand for the amount of the second brand, also in milliliters. I could have said number of milliliters of the second brand. Okay, so now that we have two unknowns, we realize we have to have two equations. We cannot solve a single equation that has two variables in it. So we need two equations. So what are the two equations going to represent? Well, there's two things going on here. There's the total amount of liquid, the total amount of dressing that she's working with, number of milliliters of each of the first two brands, and the number of milliliters in the final dressing. And then there's vinegar. Each of these bottles of liquid has a certain amount of vinegar in it. So let's sort of separate those two things into two equations. So I'm going to have one equation that's going to express the total amount of dressing in this word problem. And my second equation is just going to be the total amount of vinegar in this word problem. Okay, so we're sort of separating out the liquid from the vinegar in the liquid. So how much total dressing is there? Well, she wants to end up with 360 milliliters of dressing in the end, and she's going to get that by combining the first brand and the second brand. Well, X milliliters plus Y milliliters have to turn out to be 360. So X plus Y has to be equal to 360 milliliters. Okay, so that's an equation that expresses the total amount of dressing. So the second equation is going to just talk about the total amount of vinegar. So how much vinegar is in the first brand? Well, the first brand is 5% vinegar. And if there are X milliliters of the first brand, that means it's going to be 5% of X. That's going to be how much vinegar is in the first brand of dressing. 5% of X milliliters. And then in the second brand, there's supposed to be 13% vinegar. And there's Y milliliters. So 13% of Y is the amount of vinegar in the second brand. So if we add those two together, we're going to get the amount of vinegar in the final dressing. And the amount of vinegar in the final dressing is 6% of the total amount of dressing. So it's 6% of 360. So there's my two equations. That's my system. So I don't know about you, but I do not like decimals. Even with a calculator, I get confused. I mess up when I put them, if my fingers are too big or something. Most of the time I don't get the right answer. So I don't like dealing with decimals, and I bet you don't either. So here's what you do. You get rid of the decimals in that second equation by multiplying both sides of the equation by the LCD. Well, what's the LCD? You don't see any fractions there, do you? Well, the LCD is 100 because the first decimal is 0.05. That's 5 over 100. The second decimal is 0.13. That's 13 over 100. And the last decimal is 0.06. Well, that's just 6 over 100. So the LCD in that equation is 100. So I'm just going to multiply that entire equation by 100. And now my new system looks like this. X plus Y equals 360. And then 5x plus 13y equals 6 times 360. No more decimals. And now I could use substitution. I could use elimination, eliminate the y variable, or I could use elimination to eliminate the x variable. And I'm going to eliminate the x variable by multiplying the first equation by -5 and adding it to the second equation. So multiplying the first equation by -5 gives me -5x minus 5y equals -1800, because -5 times 360 is -1800. And then the second equation just stays the same, 5x plus 13y. Oh, and I multiplied 6 times 360, and I got 2160. So now if I add those two together, I get 8y equals 360. Divide both sides by 8. And I get y equals 45. And now I just need to go back to one of the original equations. And I like the first one. It's the simplest one. And plug in y equals 45 to get x. So x plus 45 equals 360. Subtract 45 from both sides. And I get x equals 315. And now the last part is also really important, and that is to write down your answer including the units. So she needs to use 315 milliliters of the first brand and 45 milliliters of the second brand. And that's the answer. So don't forget, write down precisely what your two variables represent. And then when you're figuring out what the two equations are going to be, separate out the total amount of liquid from the portion of the liquid that is just vinegar. Okay? So in some of these problems, it's not going to be dressing. It's going to be you're mixing something else, but there's going to be a total amount of liquid and a certain amount of something else in that liquid. And that will give you your two equations. All right, so happy solving and good night.